So I'd like to introduce our august panel. I'm honored to have all of them here. And I will just say a word about each and ask them if they'd like at this time to add to it. Of course, Frank DeAngelis at the far end, who is the principal of Columbine High School and really a hero in many ways, the way he took care of that school and the kids and the community. So let's give Frank a round of applause. And Frank, is there anything you want to add to that short bio?
I am short, so anyway, it's just an honor to be up here on the panel, and the film was just fantastic, and people asked me what I felt about it. It was really helped with the healing. And the one thing, I know we have a lot of people in attendance today that were part of that Columbine community, and you know, people always ask me, they said, you know, Columbine really needed you, but I needed Columbine much more than it needed me. And I just want to thank all the people that were part of that community. Columbine High School is fantastic, and it will always be a part of my life, even though I'm retired. So once again, thank you.
Thanks, Frank. And Kiki Leba is here. Kiki, of course, was and is a teacher at Columbine, which is pretty amazing. You'll see him. He's featured in the film. And when you get to find out, you've got to see this movie. When you see his journey, it's really extraordinary. It's an absolute honor having you here, Kiki. Thank you very much. What else could you say?
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be a part of this project, and a project that I was really never supposed to be a part of. And I love how it worked out, and I love the film, and I'm really eager for our community to see this. And also, can't wait for other communities that have been through gun violence to see this film.
So one of the things Kiki also has done, he's established an extraordinary connection at Sandy Hook in Newtown with that community, and has literally ministered in a certain way to other communities around the country. So it's just wonderful, the work he's done, and the fact he's still a rebel as well. Okay, my next guest is Rick Kaufman. Rick was co-led the crisis response team for the Jeffco Public Schools. So he had an extraordinary mission, and maybe can talk a little bit more about that. But first of all, Rick, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here, and thank you to Laura, who reached out to me a number of years ago when we were living in Minnesota at the time and talked about the film. You said it was an incredible mission, but it was not a mission that couldn't be done with some incredible teammates, some of them who are here today, who we owe a tremendous amount of gratitude to them for the dedication and focus they had in helping a community, a school and a school district heal. And I think we were successful in many respects, and we learned a lot. And I've taken that and continue to work in schools for the better part of 20 years now, and trying to make them more safe, more secure, be more prepared to respond and recover from these horrible incidents, whether it's been from Parkland to San Bernardino City Unified to Sandy Hook to a whole lot of others in between. So I'm pleased to be here and to speak on the topic of school safety.
And I'd especially like to thank Rick for his work with schools across the country. Really, he's done an extraordinary job helping thousands of people. So thank you, Rick.
Thank you. Thank you.
And maybe most importantly, we actually have a licensed therapist on our panel. Rebecca Wilson Case is here. Rebecca, thank you for being here. You're also an adjunct professor at the University of Denver, and you're the regional director for heart-centered counseling as well, a trauma expert, and you're also a trainer in EMDR. So I mean, you could talk about any of those, but what else should we add to that?
I think you covered it well, so I'm just really honored to be here. Thank you for Laura for inviting me to just sit on this panel with this amazing group of human beings. Really.
All right. Thanks so much. And last but not least, from the class of 2002, the producer and the director of the film herself. And for those of you who have seen it, she has done an absolutely extraordinary job and as someone personally who's been involved in the film industry and knows how difficult it is to make a good film because I've only made bad ones, I was just tremendously impressed with Laura Farber's work. So let's welcome our producer and director.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the panelists for participating in this. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion today and having the audience participate as well and hearing from these experts on all topics.
So we're gonna make Laura answer the first few questions, and I know she's heard a lot of these before, but I think people are really interested in just your decision to do this. How did you decide to do something that I think all of us would assume is going to be somewhat traumatic?
Yeah, I heard that also in the beginning, that it was going to be traumatic, and it didn't hit me until I actually started the work. And by starting the work, I mean by filming, going through footage.
What's your emergency? Apparently there's been a shooting up here at the Columbine High School.
Okay. We've got people on the way. Do you have any more information?
No, I don't.
One of the SWAT team guys comes in here and they bring us through, and we walk into this room. There was a good amount of officers in here. One of them says, you know, keep your hands up. So we had to, lock our hands like this. They said, when you get to the door, we're gonna do a pat down and then we'll release you. I'm looking down this hallway. The entire hallway is lined on each side with SWAT. And they gave me the clearance to go. They just said, run.
Anyway, just this project was something that's important because I felt like someone from the community, we didn't get to tell our own story. If we were there, I felt like it was narrated by everyone from the outside that hadn't been through what we had been through, and specifically the freshman class, because that's what I knew. And being there for 3 years after, and I'm not gonna lie, it is a small love letter to Columbine and the Columbine community. But that's because we joined forces, we stuck together, and it was really important that I came back to just see how everyone was doing and healing for me personally, and then I noticed that it was also happening to others around me, and the people in the film helped me through that.
I want to talk about some of the mental health issues and healing, but first of all, and Frank, I'd like to start with you, is what did you learn from this experience and from the 2 decades that you've been involved in this?
I think the thing that I learned, and I learned it early on, it's a marathon and not a sprint. And the question people ask me all the time is, when does it get back to normal? And it doesn't. We had to redefine what normal is. And the second thing I learned, we all went through the same experience, but people were feeling things differently. And that was probably the most difficult thing, meeting the needs of everyone. There were people that wanted to talk about it. There were people that wanted to journal about it, and that's how they healed. There were other people who felt the sooner I get back to doing what I was doing prior, that's going to help me heal. And then we had some people in between. So just trying to meet the needs of everyone else. And the other thing that I'm really on a crusade for is there's kids, and I call them kids, they're young adults right now, that are really struggling. And unfortunately, the mental health that was provided for us for the first 3 years is gone. And a lot of these kids did not start feeling some of the traumatic experiences they had until later, and they're trying to get help now. So I think it's a long process, and we can't give up hope, and we got to continue to help those kids that were deeply affected.
Rebecca, I'd really like you to talk a little bit about that, because I think one of the things that Frank just touched on is the fact that there's no formula, that each person literally reacts differently to these circumstances. So talk about trauma, talk about how people put in this situation, what some of the different reactions are, and why aren't we getting people the help they need?
So
That's only 6 questions.
that's a big question, yeah. So there's a number of symptoms that we can commonly experience after a traumatic event, whether that be in the immediate moments or weeks following a trauma, and then there's more of the long-term projection, as Frank is also speaking to, right? So healing takes course over a long period of time for many of us, and as Jamie mentions in the film, which I think she makes a great point to, is that it's an ongoing process. It's not something that you might just be done with at any point in time, that it can look different and evolve over the years. So following a traumatic experience, it's really normal to feel isolative, to feel anxious, to have a lot of dreams, to be thinking about the event, to be running through what you did or didn't do, trying to see what you could have done differently or what did you do right. Essentially, our brain is just trying to make sense of an experience that is out of our everyday norm, right? Unfortunately, mass shootings happen all too commonly now in this country, but still within the day-to-day experience, it is out of our norm. And so when we go through a traumatic experience, we're trying to make sense of something that doesn't really fit into our schema, our normal everyday, what does the world look like? So in regards to healing and looking at kind of the more long-term process related to trauma, if you're experiencing what we call clinically significant symptoms, which is essentially where symptoms have persisted for a significant amount of time and are impairing your day-to-day ability to function and cope. So if you have found, I can't get out of bed for the last month because I'm so depressed and I'm about to lose my job, right? If it's, I haven't been able to sleep because every night I have such intrusive and horrific nightmares, or even I'm having thoughts of wanting to end my life. That's more of an indicator that it's really time to seek some support. And trauma is not something that you need to heal on your own, and actually the research indicates that we heal best when we can connect to others. And again, healing looks different for everyone. So for Laura, part of that was making this amazing documentary. As she just said, this was my love note, right? I'm sure that was a big part of your healing,
Yes.
right? And for some of these other individuals at the panel, just being so involved in being the change in the world. And for Gus, who's in the video, right? A big piece for him is putting his experience into his art, which is his music. And so it looks different for everybody. So I think an important thing to know is that there's no script, there's no one frame that your healing process or things are supposed to look like, and to have compassion for whatever that looks like for you.
There's a lot of social workers, therapists, people that are in the helping profession that get in this profession because they have experienced something and because they were able to work through that or are continuing to work through that, and they want to support others as they do that.
The idea of not being a nurse is so hard for me to wrap my brain around. I just can't even imagine doing anything different. Maybe surrounding yourself by people that always need help gives you that space to always be needed. Maybe you're fulfilling that sense of guilt for not going back into the school.
Anybody but themselves. Everybody wants to be somebody. Trade your heaven for another hell.
It's bound to be that same old routine, same loop, same knot, same shoestrings, same top.
I've been fortunate enough to be able to have, an outlet like music and writing that really allows my emotions to run free.
You remember writing your first songs, like putting down lyrics on a page?
Would you do to be in another man's shoes? Would you walk 1,000 miles if you're asked to?
He was the first person that made me believe that there's power in words and that there's certain things that hit you, but there's also those songs that mean something to you.
But if you follow rebuttal, then you can tag along, jump into the cockpit of the catapult.
When it comes to trauma, I'd be really interested in your helping us understand some of the differences in the way people react. As a layperson, I always thought that time heals all wounds, or that at the minimum, as time passes, we all get better. And I found during the course of my life that for some people, that's not true, and some people can get better or seem better, but actually then get much worse. So talk about those kind of differences.
Yeah, so unfortunately we still don't know the exact perfect equation for how do we cure and heal trauma across the board, because each and every one of us is unique and individual in regards to what our attachment relationships have looked like, if we've experienced trauma prior to whatever maybe a recent trauma looks like, our own mental health prior to a traumatic experience. So about 60 to 70% of the population will go through a traumatic experience at some point in their life. I would expect that that number is higher for the number of people who are sitting in this room, given the topic that we're discussing today. So while most of us will go through a traumatic experience at some point in our life, most of us will not go on to develop what we call clinically significant symptoms. And why is that? We don't know the exact reason, but we do find that it's made up a number of factors based on nature and nurture. Right? So who are your connections? Do you have social supports? Do you have hobbies and interests that you're engaged in? What did your health look like prior to a traumatic event? Those are all important variables. And for those of us who do go on to develop maybe depression, anxiety, PTSD even, there's nothing wrong with you. You're having a normal reaction to an abnormal event. And so when we've experienced something of a traumatic nature, it really does have an impact on our brain. So if we put somebody with PTSD into a brain imaging scan, your brain looks different than somebody without PTSD. So that whole expectation that I think some people have of, oh, time heals all wounds and just get over it, it's really a process that's happening within your brain. And so when we develop PTSD, essentially your brain has been shocked, right? From a really scary, overwhelming experience in which you thought you might die, or that you feared that you would experience significant injury, whether that be psychological or physical. And sometimes that experience gets stuck in our brain, and that our brain can't make sense of it or digest it, and that's what leads to clinically significant symptoms, to those, I can't get out of bed, I can't stop thinking about this. Your brain just hasn't been able to make sense of what's happened.
So Kiki, that certainly seemed to have happened to you. I mean, you were in a position where you not only were there and had the direct experience and suffered as a result of that, but you also were someone that everyone was expecting to be strong, that everybody expected to lean on. So I'd be interested in your experience from that perspective, and also what did you learn? And of course, Frank, you were in the same type of situation in a big way. I'd like you, after Kiki talks, I'd like you to comment about the expectations, because from a public perspective, someone such as myself observing you, you were extraordinary. And so it was, obviously other things were going on below the surface. But Kiki, please talk about that.
The trauma that I experienced in the aftermath was something that set on immediately. I remember that night experiencing hypervigilance. And of course, I didn't know what it was called, but I remember the symptoms of hypervigilance, walking into an apartment complex and noticing where cars were parked, which porch lights were on, and details that were completely insignificant to me previously. And I began feeling the elevated levels of anxiety, elevated levels of adrenaline. My adrenal response was completely out of whack. I would have a similar adrenal response to a doorknob turning that I might hear to a gunshot. And my sleep patterns were disrupted and completely just trash. And I went through the days, I put on my game face to go to work and get through the school day. And when I would get to school, I think that was the place where I felt, ironically, I felt safe. I was ready to, that routine gave me some purpose and some focus as my concentration diminished. So that was a place where I think I was functioning the best at the time. And then when I would go home, I would let down, and I had all kinds of symptoms that I was exhibiting at home. I talk about how my family got the leftovers. They got the tattered remains of me at the end of the day and on the weekends, and I was often sleeping, battling depression. My eating habits changed and sleep patterns changed, and the inability to concentrate, became very forgetful. I remember driving and looking up at the traffic light that I was just passing under, and it was red. And completely being, just having this mental takeover by the PTSD and not really recognizing exactly all the things that were happening and how significant it was. And I think it worked its way into every aspect of my life. My immune system became weakened, and I became very sick. I was experiencing symptoms that I had never experienced previously. I experienced things like a rash on my face. I had all kinds of respiratory issues. I took 4 ambulance rides in a very short period of time for respiratory stuff. And it was all related to my lack of care for myself at that time. And I had no idea that PTSD could become such this enormous dark thing in my body and in my life.
Everyone talks about like moving forward. We need to move forward. Everybody wants to freaking move forward. You can't just say, okay, we're going forward. Moving forward looks like banners, on buildings, memorials, a moment of silence, t-shirts. Moving forward looks like a memorial run. But moving forward on the inside takes its sweet-ass time. And it happens a little bit faster if you take care of yourself. But we don't always know what that looks like or what it's supposed to be.
And so when you step back and look at the entire experience, and especially, your work with others, what are some of the lessons, what are some of the things that you've learned that really opened your eyes or you feel are important?
Well, the key is that great self-care in the aftermath. And I know that for many, counseling has a stigma attached to it or a weakness associated with it. But it's so vital to get that excellent care and to work with a trauma therapist, a therapist, a counselor who has experience in that realm, because it's not the same. And I worked with another counselor who did not have that experience, and it was not effective. When I finally connected with a trauma therapist, it was a complete game changer for me. And so that was very clear. And it's so important in the aftermath to do that. And I recognize that in my opportunities that have come up to work with other communities that have been through gun violence, that I need to be in a good place. I need to be in a great place to go and work with those communities, because to walk into a room of people that have been highly impacted by gun violence, that are highly traumatized, I need to know that I'm in a good situation to do that. And I'd be foolish of me to do otherwise. And so I'm not perfect in how I do it, but I try to do some things that look like self-care for myself. And for me, I try to keep that kind of simple. And but it's vital, and it's something like Jamie addresses in the film, that it goes on. It's a lifelong thing. It's just an added part of my life, and having that awareness.
So Frank, you were really in an extraordinary position. You had literally thousands of people, when you look at students and parents in the community, looking at you 24/7, day after day, expecting so much of you. And in many ways, you obviously delivered. What was going on inside?
And Kiki mentioned it. I actually had someone from the district tell me that if you seek mental help, that's a sign of weakness. And if you do, you better not tell anyone, because you're going to be deemed unfit for duty. And luckily, I did not listen to him or her. And who I did listen to was a Vietnam veteran who my mom worked for, a doctor. And he called me 24 hours after, and he said, I never got the help I needed when I got back from Nam. And he said, I'm struggling now. And he said, if you don't help yourself, you're not going to be able to help others. And that was the most important thing. And what I learned, I felt as a leader, I could not get in front of the staff and tell them, boy, you guys are screwed up, you better go talk to someone. Because people are going to say I'm not screwed up, and no one's going to tell me what to do. But when I got in front of the staff, I would pose the question or the dialogue saying, I don't know about you, but I'm not sleeping at night, or I wake up in the middle of the night, or I'm having nightmares. I don't know if it'll help you, but I'm talking to someone. And I think that was the most important thing. And you need to find that person that helps. because I would not be where I am today if it wasn't for counseling. And this is not for everyone either, but my faith was important. So I had those two means of support in my family. But the thing that's interesting is the fact that there are certain things that trigger these emotions. And that was one of the most difficult things in working with the students and staff. The first fire drill we did, that fire alarm set kids off. And we had to prepare things you're never prepared for. Couldn't serve Chinese food because that's what we were eating when the tragedies or shots took place. And it's an ongoing process. I think back to Parkland last February. I got off the plane. I was coming from a speaking engagement, and all of a sudden my phone just starts exploding. You're in my thoughts and prayers. We're thinking about you. Whenever that happens, I know there's another school shooting. And I saw what happened at Parkland, and even though it was in Parkland, Florida, even though it was 19 years ago, and I saw those kids running out of the school, it took me back to Columbine, what I refer to as a Columbine or the Rebel March. And I had to get myself together, and something I learned through counseling is called touchstones, and I wear some medals around my neck, and I start grabbing those saying, this is not 1999. When people say counseling's a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, and this is what I pose to people, and Kiki touched upon it. I mean, if you broke your arm, and people will say, well, I got my spouse, I have my significant other to talk to, that's great. But if you broke your arm, would you allow them to fix your arm? I know my wife would like to fix my arm at times, but one of the things that's important is you need to get that professional help, a trained therapist, and I think that's important.
Frank, when you, looking at, what has happened since and looking at your situation, how did you deal with the fact that so many people, number one, expected you to be really the man throughout the process? And number two, did the district, you feel, provide, or did other entities provide the resources that your staff needed and your students needed for this trauma?
Yes, and I really believe I was so fortunate to have the support of John DeStefano, who was the school board president. I tell people this, if a Columbine would happen today, I'm not sure if I could have kept my job. And it was just because of all the politics out there. And I know in working with Parkland, we're working with Santa Fe, and some of these other places, they're looking to move people out, blame people. And I had the support of the school board, I had the support of superintendent and others, so I had a lot of support. Probably the best support I had as principal is they brought on someone to help me. And you can check with the kids or young adults. I was a very visible principal, and that's the thing I loved. I had a difficult time getting into administration because I was afraid I was going to be removed from the kids, so I made a point to be in classes, be in the cafeteria, and things of that nature. So after the tragedy, I felt it was very important that I continued to be visible not only for the students but for the staff. And so they brought someone on to help me deal with the aftermath of the 20th, and that really helped a lot. And I think for the kids, it was real interesting, and I know Laura talked about it, and I think Jamie talked about it, and Amy. A lot of them didn't want to talk. And it's real interesting, talking to parents of the kids, that was one of the things they said, we wish we would have been a little more persistent in getting our kids help, because they said they were fine. And one of the things that they did is they tried to keep so much away from their parents because they didn't want their parents to be afraid of what they experienced.
As you entered the doors of CHS 4 years ago, no one anticipated that you would encounter so much adversity, hardship, sorrow, and heartache in your young lives. You were forced to grow up far too quickly, and you were denied a normal high school life.
So Laura, certainly the movie will be cathartic for a lot of people and be part of their healing. Do you think it will also be traumatic for a lot of people?
Yeah, I do. I think I was really curious because, I'm super excited that the film finally is home and people in the community have the opportunity to see it, but that doesn't mean that everyone's going to show up, and I think that it takes strength to actually come to a movie theater and see this film.
Will there be a special showing at Columbine?
I don't know. I think we're talking about that. I don't know if that's the venue for it, but it's everyone's in a different place,
right.
And I have to respect that as well. I hope that people would come out, especially from the community, because I think it will help, and I think it's uplifting. I tried to not focus on certain things for certain reasons, but I wanted it to be hopeful because the participants are hopeful. They taught me so much.
Well, it's really about, I mean, it features 4 key people, and Kiki being one of them, and so that's what this movie is truly about. In terms of, we're talking about how people react differently. How was your journey in terms of getting people to talk? Because I would assume there are probably a lot of people who were not going to be interested in participating.
No, yeah, I learned that very quickly, you know, because I wanted a whole range of students, alumni, and not knowing where anybody was or how they were doing, but very quickly I learned that the people that were not ready to speak about their experience were not going to be on camera.
I haven't been in this room, I haven't told my story actually walking through it ever. So that brings a whole new element to it.
And, you know, I think that sends a tremendous message that 2 decades later, you have so many people who are still suffering. So, Rick, I have a lot of questions for you because of your work all over the country, but I'd like to start off with just kind of the key lesson or lessons. You know, what have you learned from your experience? Because, I mean, you've not only, of course, were involved intimately at the time, but then you've been involved in a number of other crisis situations as you try to help communities across the country.
I think the one interesting thing we've learned is we talk a lot about the recovery process, but a lot of what our hope and work really is focused on is the prevention, the mitigation, and intervention work, that we don't get to the point where we have students and staff and families torn apart by the school violence. And so Rebecca talks a lot about brain research after the fact and how you deal with it. And we've done a lot of work in the brain research of how people can best prepare for the worst case scenario. And that's probably 70% of my work with schools is focused on is how do we prepare for the worst case scenario. You prepare for the worst, hope for the best. And by understanding how the brain works is identifying a trigger that helps the brain to say, if you are in a situation, a violent situation, or a traumatic situation, what do you want to do? And so as we go across the country and work with schools, as many other experts do, it's about what you want to be able to do to mitigate the likelihood of a really bad outcome. And so while schools have done significant work in terms of the physical structure changes, that is just one aspect. The crisis emergency management is really multi-layered. And for me, I think the biggest learning is being prepared, because for those of you that are parents and you've been through school, we never thought that would occur. As a parent of several children, it puts you in a really, really unique position to say, you don't want your children to ever have to experience that. So how do we prepare them? How do we prepare our teachers and our staff for the unlikely situation? But unfortunately, the frequency of those causes us such great alarm.
And you talk about the frequency in the United States. Since January 1st of 2009, we've had almost 300 of these incidents. When you look at other countries, I mean, Afghanistan had 3. The United Kingdom, Italy, France had 0. Germany had 1. Why? I'd like each of you, if you have an opinion, to give your sense of why is there such a stark difference. And obviously, even if you do this on a per capita basis, our numbers are really extraordinary. Our numbers are really extraordinary. So actually, Rebecca, I'd like your take on this first, and Rick, I'd like you to go second.
It's a bit of a hot topic.
Yeah.
Question. I think that it's a mixture of a multitude of very complex dynamics, right? A lot of them being related to just the culture and society that we live in. So there's certainly, just want to be careful about, I don't want to get into anything political, but what are our gun rights? What are our laws on gun rights? There's certainly, I think, the impact of social media, of kind of a copycat syndrome. The more that we portray horrific incidents, the more likely it is that somebody's going to think, I'm going to go try and top that, essentially. I think that those are just some of the dynamics, but certainly not all of them.
Rick, go ahead, please.
You know, yeah, I think there's what Rebecca said there. I mean, there's lots of different issues, and people will fall on various different right side, left side, or whatever side of the line of those issues. You know, whether it's guns, whether it's social media, whether it's the breakdown of the family, there's mental health. I believe that our schools are microcosms of our communities. They reflect the values, the good and the bad of our communities. And when we see a society that is tending towards more violence, to more intolerance, to more division, it just permeates through our schools. Our kids are living what they see, feel, and hear in our community. And they're bombarded by all of these various different senses and experiences. And when we don't address those concerns, whether in the home or the schools or other social agencies to provide the resources, then we see a continued disenfranchisement, a disengagement of students and others within our communities that look to violence as a way, either a call for help or a response to the call for attention, if you will. So we could say it's guns, we could say it's mental health, we could say it's the breakdown of the family structure, but I agree with Rebecca, it's a combination of a lot of different sources. And again, we can all wring our hands and talk about those things. I like to think that we are smarter and better about tackling these issues and dealing with it in our schools, in our communities, and we can't do it alone. If we don't have those partnerships, those collaborations, and the ability to work with outside agencies, the ability to work within our schools, in our communities, we will continue to fail our kids. So find the conversation that fits best and find a way to work with our kids in our communities, or we're going to see more of the violence that we see.
You know, you reference not specific numbers, but one of the things, Rick, I'd like you to address is there are many, many times when school authorities, teachers, law enforcement, others actually do intervene and prevent, and with the involvement often of students, often originating with a tip or comment from students, actually have really stopped another disaster from happening. But the public doesn't hear about it. The media obviously does not publicize those good events, of which there are many every year. Talk a little bit about that, and what else can we do to really affect the change in terms of trying to help people who could be on the border. I'd like to make one other comment, though. I think another thing statistically people don't realize is that you go back to someone's social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, and you see all these terrible things, and you look at them and you say, oh my gosh, how come no one looked at this, and how come no one said anything? And what we don't realize is there are hundreds of thousands of people saying these same things. And so it's very difficult for school authorities or law enforcement to know, when do you take it seriously? How do we do a better job of that?
You know, Frank mentioned it. We know, while it's very difficult to profile a mass violent attacker, what we do know is that they talk to others, they share it through social media, they have diaries, they have lots of different ways that they can share that information. We call it leakage, and typically that leakage, others know about it. And so when others feel empowered to bring that information forward to an adult, then we can react, then we can respond, and we can intervene. And as Aaron said, there have been the truly success stories when it comes to school violence is when there is no school violence because the intervention has occurred. And that could be because someone has come forward and we can provide the resources to intervene, not just from the law enforcement perspective. We're not trying to create pipelines from cradle to prisons. What we're doing in terms of intervening is the things that Rebecca talks about too, providing those interventions to address the mental health concerns, the broken families, whatever the causes that lead to that. So the intervening piece is that when we can avert these potential tragedies, which we don't hear about, those are truly our success stories. The other thing
let me interrupt you
Sure.
for a second. So in terms of those success stories, do we in any way celebrate, especially the kids who bring that information to our attention? Do we reward them? Do we make it clear that they're models for other students? And of course, you run the risk of people being afraid of retribution and all that, but do we communicate? Are there schools that communicate that when someone does this, even if they're not necessarily named, do we say to the rest of the student body, because a person in your class came forward, he or she saved potentially tens of lives or more. I don't see that. Do we do that? Should we do that?
We do that. We should do it, and it is a careful balance between singling someone out or just praising the fact that someone came forward. And we do that in lots of different ways, and we encourage parents through communication or engaging and working with parents to do the same thing. It's, those, I can't underscore the power of when someone comes forth with information that we can intervene. And we may not know that individual has a violent cell in his or her body, but the fact that we're getting them help. The other thing that you talked about, Aaron, as part of your question is watching today's youth, not just what the kids at Parkland have done, which was amazing, and yes, a lot of it was on the gun control, but we have students and I have college-age kids that they are making changes. They are addressing these kinds of societal issues in their own small worlds and in their communities. They're developing communities of empowerment to stop the violence in many different ways. So in all respects, we should never stop our youth, no matter what age, in their abilities to help us as adults learn what their world is like and continue to empower them and encourage them to have their voices heard and to be the change agents. Because I am a first-time grandfather, and I saw him for the first time yesterday. And I look in his eyes and I say, I want a different world for him, just like I want a different world for all of your kids and grandkids. And it is possible. We just have to believe and we have to work towards it.
Guideline, there's no script. Just kind of doing the best you can every day.
People, they think that there's these concentric circles of trauma. So if you're at, ground zero of the event, that you're more screwed up. And if you were further away from that, if you were in another room and you were locked in, you were probably not as damaged. And if you were on the other side of the building and you didn't hear or see anything, you were probably okay. And if you were outside at lunch, you were fine. It didn't matter where people were, necessarily what they saw.
Okay, I know I've been asking all the questions, and I think some of you would like to ask questions. So we're going to set up a microphone so we can take questions from the audience. If you do have a question, simply just state your name and maybe what town you live in, and then ask your question, please.
I'm Dr. Sue Ladley. I'm a physician in Denver, rehabilitation. Was part of the response to Columbine shooting, taking care of some of the injured kids. And I continue to take care of kids every week in Denver who are victims of gun violence. And I guess I think of it as a public health crisis, and I wonder if anyone here thinks of it that way or could speak to that concept. And that's kind of how I'm imagining we might really wrestle with the primary prevention. So, putting it to the panel.
All right, thank you very much. I think, Rebecca, I'm going to let you tackle that first. I know one of the things, there's some hesitation on a part of some members of the panel to talk about gun violence, but I'm going to encourage you to say exactly how you feel.
Well, I would absolutely agree that it is a health crisis. I think that trauma is a health crisis in our society, period, whether that be mass shootings, whether that be sexual assaults, whether that be traumatic experiences we've suffered in childhood. We have an epidemic of trauma in our society, and research really points to that, and long-term devastating health consequences on our psychological and physical health from not dealing with trauma appropriately.
So have we always had an epidemic? And if not, why do we have one now?
Yes, so I think that we've had an epidemic for quite a while. I don't think that we actually started researching it or looking at what is trauma and how does it impact us throughout our lifespan until about the 90s was really the decade of brain research when we really recognized trauma is a real thing and it really impacts our brains, and it's not just get over it.
So are you positing that this is a function of our culture?
I don't know that I'm positing that specifically. I don't think that I would get into why is that, but rather we have an issue and it's time that we start showing up to it.
Laura, did you want to comment?
Yeah, no, I just, we say mental health, that's just such a broad statement, and what does that mean? And I don't know, I would agree that it's all part of our health and our well-being as individuals. And I think we've all been through some traumatic stuff, maybe something not as traumatic as Columbine. I mean, maybe you've lost a loved one. I mean, anything. There is trauma, and I think tools and coping and what is trauma and what does that mean? It's so broad. And, my trauma is different from your trauma, but then how do we cope with it, and what are we supposed to do? I mean, you can talk about it, you can drink, you can do drugs. Those aren't healthy ways, but those are what we have at our fingertips. So, to me, I think it is an overall public health issue, because it affects everybody.
Kiki, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think that we have to, we all have to find a way to be living in the solution with this, and not focusing on the problems. And everybody that has been through this, it seems like they all find their way. They find something that they focus on, a cause, somewhere that they focus that energy. I think of my friend Abby Clements at Sandy Hook, who was just this completely angry and broken teacher in the aftermath. And she has turned that into becoming just a great voice and working with groups like Moms and Sensible Gun Control. And it's just been wonderful to watch her shift from being angry about being a victim to being a woman of action in the aftermath of this. And so what does that look like for each of us? I think that's a very personal thing, and obviously people are called to do that. And it is such a personal thing. And I think, when I have that opportunity, I'm going to take it. And what is it going to take? I mean, every time we say this is, how can we imagine anything worse than this? And yet we do, and nothing changes. But yes, of course I use my vote, but it takes more than that. I have to, get out and walk the walk, and and do the work to be a part of the change, and stop doing, lip service isn't going to do this, and I can't wait for anybody. We've got to be in a place of action.
Okay. Oh, we have another question. Please, your name and what town do you live in?
My name is Lily. I live in Denver. Now in school settings, we're doing what they call like a code red or an active shooter drill. And long story short, the question that they're raising is, number one, how effective are those? Because a lot of time what happens in active shooter situations is fight or flight takes over. And they're teaching the teachers to, lock the door, put all of the students somewhere safe and just stay put. But in reality, when that happens, that's not what the teachers are doing. The possibility that drill in and of itself can be traumatizing to the students. And so I think that there's a lot more kind of research and acceptance on the back end of a crisis of, yes, getting to counseling, getting to a trauma counselor and kind of going through the steps, but there's not as much research or information in my realm of what happens before. So I'd love to hear if you think that those drills are effective, what you've seen happening in the years since 1999. And I think, Rick, if you seem to be the expert there, yeah.
We can also talk a little bit about what is effective, where schools now have often only a single entry to the school. Right. Some schools have vestibules where you literally are in a contained space before you're allowed in. Right. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. And it is, we could talk about for a half hour, but we're running out of time, so I'm going to make it real brief. Is it effective? Absolutely. Partly goes back to the brain research we've been doing for the last, since 2011, trying to figure out why people did what they did. It's called an acute stress syndrome, and it does come from fight, flight, or fright responses. But what we do know is that your brain is looking for a trigger to be able to respond to the condition that you are experiencing or living through. And so the more we train the brain to respond, the better we are. In fact, what we're doing, we're trying to create the cultural condition, actually, to do what we want you to do. So when it's hide, run, fight, or lockdown, evacuation, or shelter in place, the idea is the more we train, the more we drill, which is why states really do require those drills, and the more we treat it, we mentally simulate for the brain that this is what you would do in those kinds of situations. It is oftentimes we hear people say, well, you need to run first, or you need to hide first. If you've worked in schools, if you've been in schools, not just as a student, we look for what is intuitive. And so our training really is focused on what the triggers for the brain. The problem with codes, code red, code blue, you could go through this room and ask people what code red means to you, and you'll get lots of different definitions for it. The idea is, let's make it simple for the brain. When we say lockdown, the brain trigger is triggering you to go lockdown, and then you practice those procedures. Whether it says to run or evacuate. That is the whole idea over this. The last 5 or 6 years, where the emphasis in schools has been on the focus on those drills and training, and treat it as if it's the real thing. Now, you also asked the impact on, is it more traumatic for kids? Is it traumatic? Yes, but when you develop that, or I should say when kids start coming to school first and then you reinforce that each year, you build that cultural condition that you're trying to do. And when we do that in that non-threatening manner, we do, not only is it supplanted in the brain, but it's that repetition that they understand. Is it somewhat traumatic then when we do a drill, sometimes unannounced? Yes, it is, but I would rather that be somewhat traumatic for the student and the staff than for them to have a real world situation and not know what to do, running into harm's way. So I actually go against the government's approach, which is run first and hide second, because intuitively, after watching this for 20 years working in schools, intuitively, hiding is really first and foremost the most and safest approach. If you are in an unsecured location, running and getting out of the building, getting to a safe place is the best approach. So we're teaching students and staff now, empowering them to make the decision that will help to save their life, so that we don't do everything in a rote fashion. But what do you do when you're encountered with that?
Did you want to comment on that, Rebecca?
Well, I side with everything that Rick is saying. I think the important thing to be mindful of with drills is essentially you are training your brain to stay on board and to not regress into fight, flight, or freeze. So, for example, how can firefighters run into a burning building? They practice a lot, right? And yes, as a drill may be traumatizing, it's not on the same level of mass chaos in light of an actual traumatic mass shooting, right, and not knowing what to do. So we're attempting to keep the brain online to be able to function.
And one additional point, our students look to the adults in the building. Even your high school students will look to the adults for direction, for what to do. And that's why it's so critical that we do those frequent trainings and drills throughout the year, and we don't do it all in the fall because it's nice weather or in the spring. We do it in those other unannounced times.
Frank, go ahead, please.
Also, I think what Rebecca and Rick are talking about also is some type of plan, but a lot of it's situational awareness, and I think that's important because in some cases would warrant running, others would hide. But the one thing in the research that I've done and attending conferences, the one thing that seems as a deterrent is a locked classroom door. And there's only been 2 instances in which someone breached that door. I think it was in Red Lakes, Minnesota. And that's what we're trying to teach teachers to do now, to lock that door. And I think you're going to see new buildings that are being constructed that they will be able to lock their doors from the inside. Because a lot of times when trauma takes place, trying to go outside the door, find that key to lock, it's not going to happen. And so usually what happens if there is a perpetrator in the building, and he or she cannot get in the door, they're going to move on to a soft target. So it's things like that that are important.
So Laura, as a survivor, I'd be really interested in just how you view your fellow students at Columbine who experienced something for the first time in our country on that scale. And then when you look at today's schools like the kids in Parkland in Florida, and the level of activism and being public. Contrast that and what's going on.
Yeah, no, I think what they're doing at Parkland is incredible. It just blows my mind because it's so different from what we went through without cell phones and just not wanting to talk about it. I mean, I think we were definitely, forced into being the guinea pigs for something like this. But I think because we were forced into it, there was definitely some pullback. And, this happened to us and it was private, and now we didn't grow up learning lockdowns and learning about school shootings. And so we didn't have a point of reference, and so we just sort of did it however we knew best. But nowadays, I think when you grow up in school and learning about this stuff, you're prepared for that, just like you're prepared for a fire drill like we had. But I think it's incredible what they're doing. I think that they're strong, and they're strong together, and they're speaking about positive changes. And I think it's great.
So, Rebecca, what can we do as parents to do a better job? Because when we look at what kids have done, I mean, I know often when there is a school shooting, many of us in the public are quick to blame parents. How did they not know? Look at what these kids were buying or putting in their room or putting on social media. How much do we have the blame, and how can we do a better job? And are we the first line of defense, or is it fellow students?
I don't think there's just one answer to that question. So certainly as a parent, I think it's important that you be mindful of what are you modeling to your children. And are you connected to your kids? And if you are concerned about some red flags concerning behaviors, reach out to a mental health professional and get some support, some resources, and some guidance on how to manage that situation. Now, on the opposite end, if you are the parent of a child who has experienced a traumatic event, it's important that you be there to be a nurturing relationship, but there's a fine line between giving somebody space and not giving them so much space that you're just not present, right? So it's important not to come on in an invasive way, right? So that individuals feel that they're being overly burdened with they need to talk about things, or you have to go talk to somebody right now. As we had talked about earlier, everybody's healing path is their own journey and looks different. So I think it's important to walk that line between being there and being a nurturing support, but not being so overwhelming, or as we sometimes say, a helicopter parent, right? Which can certainly, I think we know with teenagers, can be a quick way to close the door.
Frank?
The only thing I would want to add, they've done a wonderful job, is trauma, it's not a competition, who suffers more. And I think a lot of times we make reference, well, I didn't go through a Columbine, but if you're suffering, trauma's trauma. And I think that's the most important thing, is there's help out there, and you never have to travel that journey alone. And for us sitting up here, if we did not get the help that we needed, we could not go out and do what we're doing right now to help some of these other communities. So once again, counseling is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. And think about next time you travel on an airplane, and what they tell you, the flight attendant will say, if you lose pressure in the cabin and the mask comes down, make sure you put that mask on yourself before you help someone else. It's the same thing. You need to get that help and support to continue to fight the good fight.
Kiki.
I think the question most people ask, that they know I'm a person of faith, and they said, how could there be a God when 13 were killed, so many were injured? And I said, if there's not, those bombs would have went off in the building, and there would have been 600 to 700 people who would have died that day. But I really felt that there are things that can't be explained.
Kiki, you referenced anger. I want to go to our next question in a minute. I think there were certainly a lot of people angry about different things. I mean, there were people angry at the attacker's parents. Certainly, there were people angry at the school that felt that there were things that the school could have or should have done. There were people angry at law enforcement for not going in, for waiting almost an hour before they went into the school. There were a lot of things. There were people angry at the media for how things were often very inaccurately portrayed, and we can talk about that separately as well. But I'd be, and maybe Rebecca, I'd be interested in Kiki's example of two things. One, his example of how someone took their anger and turned it into something constructive, which I think, my guess, is rare. But the other thing is, it seems that kind of anger can really fester, and it strikes me, and I'd be interested from a psychological perspective, it just strikes me that kind of anger is really difficult to overcome when you think someone else made a serious mistake that impacted your life, that cost the life of a loved one.
So after an event that we can't make sense of, it's common for us to want to point the finger and pose blame, right? Because if we can identify whose fault it was, then it helps us to file away just an inconceivable event into, oh, well, this is why it happens, because it's this person's or this person's fault, right? When in reality, the only person to blame for a traumatic experience is the person who perpetrated the violence. Right? We don't have a crystal ball. We cannot predict everybody's behaviors. And essentially, we need to make sure that we're putting blame where blame is and recognize that that desire to place blame is only an effort for us to feel a bit safer in a world that just doesn't make sense sometimes. Now, I think also speaking to Kiki and Frank's stories, right, there's also this other side of trauma that is known in the professional community as post-traumatic growth. And that is that when we've gone through something traumatic and we do our work and we show up to what we need to do to heal for ourselves, there's this amazing resiliency as demonstrated by both of these gentlemen on the other side, right? For what you can then offer to the world, which I'm sure that they were amazing people beforehand. I didn't know them beforehand, right? But look at all of the gifts that they have brought to the world now, unfortunately because of the adversity that they've faced. Laura as well, right? But this is the amazing thing about the opposite side of trauma, when we do our healing, that research really shows that those of us who have faced adversity and worked through it are much more resilient and adaptive human beings overall.
For those of you who want to answer this kind of more an overarching or bigger question, is it's just a concept of, in the United States, our belief in the sanctity of life and the idea that we have troubled people, some troubled, some not seemingly troubled, actually, especially when you look at the background of the Las Vegas shooter. Is there something missing in our culture, Frank, in terms of, are we not imbuing a respect for life in our children and in ourselves and our peers at a level where this would really stop everyone or almost everyone?
I'm a little bit worried because I think we're becoming desensitized, and it worries me when we hear of another shooting and people they don't seem to be fazed. It's like, okay, how many this time? And we can't accept that. I mean, it can't. We got to continue to fight. And as I stated time and time again, and Rick mentioned his grandchild, and I have a grandchild, my wife and I have a grandchild, the kids are our future. And we have to do everything in our power to protect them. And I think what ends up happening, and this was a question that got posed to me time and time again after the tragedy, they kept saying, Frank, what are you going to do? What is the school going to do? What are we going to do? And I think as society, we got to say enough is enough. And we've got to step up, and we can't allow this to continue to happen. And I look at some of the stuff that's out there, and I know, thinking back to Columbine, they blamed it on the Marilyn Manson music, they blamed it on the game Doom. And you look at some of those games that they were playing now was really not very difficult as far as desensitizing kids. Some of these video games that these kids are playing right now, it desensitizes them. I think we got to look at some of the things we're doing in society, and it's as parents, as educators, we need to say enough's enough.
Frank, I'd like you to comment on that. And also, just in terms of your career, your multi-decade career in education, talk about the expectations and if they're reasonable and how they've changed of what we expect schools and teachers and administrators and support staff to do today compared to 30 or 40 years ago.
Right. And Rick and Rebecca really touched upon it. I think it's important. I think people are out there and they want one set answer, and the easy place to go is tougher gun laws, and that's one piece to the puzzle. But the mental health piece, the parenting, social media. But I think now we live in a society, thinking back to 1999, the only drills we ever did were fire drills. And I don't know how many kids have ever been killed or teachers been killed in a fire. But because of what happened at Columbine High School, now we're doing these drills. In the state of Colorado, there's legislation stating that mandatory drills have to take place, an evacuation drill and then some type of lockdown drill. And I think a lot of people feel that if we don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. And that scares me a little bit. And we are living in a society that we have seen violence increase, so we need to tell our kids, train our kids, and it's got to be age appropriate. And I think you do that with most kids. And I've had elementary teachers say, well, we don't want to scare the kids. But as parents, as grandparents, you tell your kids, don't talk to strangers. Well, if something happens in a school, unfortunately, like what happened at Sandy Hook, those kids need to be prepared. And I think one of the most difficult things, and Kiki and I have had this conversation on several occasions, when I started teaching back in 1979 to where I retired in 2014, it has changed. And what teachers will say, we don't have time to do this because of the mandatory testing and things of that nature, but I think these drills and things have to be a part of it, and it's just being able to work it into your schedule, and it's a disservice.
One of the substitute teachers, I believe, I could hear her running down this hallway, coming around the corner, and she yelled, everybody get back in your room, there's kids with guns. And then as soon as I, stepped my first foot in the door, one of the pipe bombs went off.
It sounded sort of like the band coming down the hallway with banging their instruments, not playing them, but banging them. Coach Ortiz ran out of the classroom to go see what was going on, and Mrs. Moore followed behind him and was locking the classroom door. She was shaking and trying to get the keys in the lock. And once she locked it, then she came back up this way and told everybody, everybody get behind my desk, get behind my desk.
Kiki, go ahead, please.
The thing that stands out in my mind is after the Parkland shooting, witnessing a young woman, a student at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, go on camera and these words that I've been waiting for, and she says, I knew it was a matter of time. And previously we always hear, we never thought it would happen here. And when that student from that high school said, I knew it was a matter of time, I think it spoke volumes to me, and that as a generation, we haven't been prepared to take significant action in making a change. But I think this young generation, the way they're talking and doing things now, I think we're going to see some serious change. But it is a multifaceted piece. And the mental health piece is certainly significant. I know that with NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists, their recent statistics on school psychologists per student ratio is 1 per 1,300 in a high school. And we take better care of everything. Cars, our computers, our phones. We give more attention and service and better number ratios to practically everything we own than we do our students in our schools. And those numbers are ridiculous. When we talk about having better mental health care for our students, to have that sort of ratio, and I like at our school, we have one school psychologist, and we have about 1,700 students. And we have guidance counselors, but they're not qualified to do that sort of mental health work. And so if we want to see some significant changes there, we've got to address that issue as well. And our schools, obviously, we need, going to be funding to bring that in, but how do we make that so important?
So, Frank, I'd like you to follow up a little on that.
And I think one of the most important things is we need to empower our students. If they see something, say something, hear something, say something, because most of these people that are carrying out these acts of violence broadcast it. And I think prior to Columbine, people said, well, they'll never carry it out. But I really believe that their broadcast, especially now with social media, which is so much more, it's more prevalent than what it was prior to Columbine High School. And so if these kids do come forward, and I think, I will never be hopeless or helpless, and I know we continue to hear about these shootings that continue to happen, but how many have been stopped because of things we have in place that were not in place prior to Columbine? And so getting these kids to come forward can stop this. If they see something on social media, to stop it, the drills that we're doing. And not to go into a lot what happened that day, but we look at the protocol used by the police that day, which was secure the perimeter. And SWAT arrived 50 minutes later, and that's the first time police went into the building. Now, responding officers are going in immediately. So it's all these pieces, as Kiki's pointed out, Rebecca and Rick pointed out. But I think it's the kids. And they, a lot of times these kids, if they see it, we need to have a thing in place. In Colorado, we have something called Safe to Tell, which is a 24/7 anonymous tip line, and it has really helped in preventing some of these, but more so with suicide rate increasing. A lot of these kids are realizing their friends are in trouble and they got a place now to tell to get those people help, so that's important.
We have another question. Your name and the town you reside in.
I'm Katie, and I actually live in Littleton right now. I've lived in Littleton for 5 months, about a mile away from Columbine, so that's interesting. I know that you talked about the red flags, but some kids don't have red flags. Some kids have something inside them that's slow burning. They may have friends, they might just seem shy, but then they might, have something inside them that causes them to hurt themselves or others. So do you find that that happens? But also I have a question about the media coverage, because as I said, I remember watching it every night over the summer. It was like, this is your nightly Columbine report. I remember seeing interviews right after the shooting. There's one young lady that was interviewed, and she was talking about her trauma right away, right after it happened. Do you find that the media coverage, because you spoke about social media and people trying to copycat, do you find the media's been getting better or worse over the past 20 years? Do you think that they're doing a good job, like no notoriety, don't talk about what they wore, don't glamorize it, just figure out how to stop it? Do you think that they're getting better or worse, and are there changes in the media that you would love to, say, hey, you know what, you have to stop this. This is serious. I hope it wasn't too wordy. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I would like.
Go ahead, Frank, please.
When I go out and present, I talk about my involvement that day, but I talk about creating a welcoming environment, inclusiveness and things of that nature, because that's important. And I think when I became a better principal I think so many times I could walk through the halls of Columbine High School and they would say, we're Columbine, we're family, this type of thing, but there were some kids that weren't feeling that. And when I became a better principal is when I walked outside the doors of Columbine High School and I found some kids that were in the smoking pit or some kids over at the skate park, and I said, guys, what are you doing? How come you're not in class? And they said, we don't feel a part of your school. And there's kids at your school that could care less if we came back, and that really broke my heart. And I really made an attempt to try to be as inclusive as possible. So what your friend is stating, I think we did build that family. And after the tragedy, we could either make it define us and say Columbine is going to be remembered always, but we decided we were going to move forward. And what I mean by moving forward is we were going to heal. We'll never forget the 13 who lost their lives, but at the same time, it's a time for hope. And that's, I think, what Columbine represents. And as far as the media, and then I'll turn it over to them, I think the reason we're still talking about Columbine was the way the media portrayed it. And I'm amazed when I go out and talk, people said, gosh, Columbine was the first school shooting. It was not. There were school shootings dating back to the 1700s. And even within 1990, you had Jonesboro, you had Pearl, Mississippi, you had Paducah. But I think Columbine, for the first time, brought it into our living rooms. And for me, I remember where I was when Kennedy was assassinated. I'm amazed when I go out and speak and people say the story you just did. I remember where I was when Columbine happened. And I think the media's learned by that. And I think what you talked about, the copycat, that scares me. There have been 74 instances where kids have planned school shootings that made mention of Columbine High School. 4 of the major ones that they actually made reference to the 2 killers, and they actually went on to do what they did at Sandy Hook and Virginia Tech. So I think the media is learning just like all of us.
Any other comments to answer either of her questions, Rick?
I would just add that the Radio Television News Directors Association, RTND, at the behest of several of us and after Columbine, did meet and develop some guidelines how to address the school violent incidents, these mass casualty incidents, and the impact that it has on the community and the individuals that are part of that. I don't know if those guidelines are always followed. There is a rush of wanting to get information. We live in a world today where We abhor the fact that we don't have information, and social media fills in a lot of those gaps. And so the media is really feeding that beast, so to speak, to get information. And oftentimes it's information that is, it's not accurate. It's information that probably does more from the traumatic standpoint and elongates or exacerbates the issue at hand. But by and large, I think media has done a very good job and learned the values of not recognizing the perpetrators and focusing on the victims and the healing process. Because, again, I got to reference the colleagues here. Our focus really was how do we heal, how do we return back to normalcy? And we couldn't do that unless we focused on the victims and the victims' families and the community. So everything we did, every decision we made was focused on those two very things. And the more we continue to work with our media folks when they're covering these issues, and they understand that, the better the community will be in the whole healing process.
Go ahead, Laura. I'm going to, after Laura, I've got a quick question on the media, and really I'd be interested to have Rebecca address what is the impact on people, or what can be the impact on a person who watches an event unfold live today, which if you don't see it on television, you may see it on Facebook Live or something else. And of course you have the interplay now between media and social media. But Laura, go ahead, and then I'm going to ask each panelist if he or she would like to make a final comment. So, Laura, please.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly kind of what I was going to bring up. Two things. One, I think Kiki pointed this out in the film, which was that a lesson we learned was that someone coming out of a traumatic situation isn't always the most reliable source, and those are the people I think that reporters or camera people pull out first because they're available, and I don't think that's helpful for anybody. And I don't know if, what they say, maybe they want to take back what they had said at that time. I don't think it's fair to attack somebody right out of a situation, and that would be a lesson for the media. But also, it was Parkland where I saw for the first time like that Facebook Live, and then you can hear the gunshots, and also in Vegas where they kept replaying on the news the bullets and how fast they were, and I just thought, what benefit is this for anybody? And then personally for me, it was like it didn't help at all. And then that you can always go back and get that information. I just feel like law enforcement would benefit first from something like that, from like Facebook Live. I'm sure there's lots of information that might prevent something that, I don't know, I would love to hear from you how you feel about replaying those negative sounds and images over and over.
Well, you're going to get that opportunity.
Yeah.
So address that, and also my original question, which is what can the impact be, or what are the range of impacts on a person watching an event unfold live where people are being killed?
Yeah. So to be impacted by trauma, you don't have to experience the trauma firsthand. So certainly if you're watching the Facebook Live, if you're glued to the TV, you can experience trauma. You can traumatize yourself, absolutely. Now our brains have this interesting process where we're kind of drawn to horrible stuff, right? We want to learn more information, and we think on kind of an evolutionary level, it's essentially we're looking for what the threat is so that we can keep ourselves safe. But then we can easily step into this kind of space of voyeurism, right? And I think that we need to be really mindful of, if you are watching those Facebook Live feeds, if you are watching, the YouTube video that's streaming the sounds of the Las Vegas shooting over and over again, ask yourself why. You are a consumer, and you need to be mindful and responsible for what you're consuming, because if you're engaged in consuming those platforms, you are creating a demand for that as well. And I think from Columbine and from a number of other experiences, we know that the social media can have a horrific impact, the media as well, on not only survivors' experience, but how trauma is then perpetuated throughout our society.
Okay, thank you. Frank, I'm going to let you start off if you have a final comment, and we'll come down the line.
Just, again, an honor to be here, and Laura, I just want to thank you for bringing this to the attention and really telling about Columbine and the impact that it's had on so many. So once again, thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Frank. Kiki.
It's my hope that this film and this panel and this conversation will inspire some others in the audience and people who hear this and see this to have conversations in their communities and with their social groups, that this is the sort of thing that spreads because of you.
Thank you, Kiki. Rick?
Two things. I want to thank the team that was there on that day and continued to work with students and staff. And I want to thank the subjects of the film because I've had a chance to see it now, and Laura has done an amazing job. You're going to laugh, you're going to cry, you're going to cheer, you're going to have emotions. But the subjects of the film, thank you for your gift of sharing. Thank you for letting us see a part of the world that most people don't get to see, and that's the healing part, the redemptive spirit that each of you brought to the film, and what Laura put on the screen. It's just powerful. She's an amazing person, amazing filmmaker, and I someday, soon, the world gets to see this movie because it is a testament after 20 years of an incredible community, an incredible school, incredible staff and students.
Rebecca?
So the word that's just going through my mind is resiliency, and the resiliency not only of this community, but the resiliency that was demonstrated by all the individuals in the film, Amy, Zach, Jamie, Gus, Kiki, and Frank, and Laura for creating the space to have this conversation. I think that these conversations and communities are needed, and a way to connect and a way to persevere.
Laura, you get the last word.
Oh boy, no, I mean, God, I second everything. I second the participants. Couldn't have done it without them. Couldn't have done it without the crew, everyone that's helped with the film, allowed me to film in the school, and I hope everyone gets a chance to see it. And thank you for moderating. Thank you for being here and being a part of this. I didn't know what this was going to look like today, but I'm really happy that we had this conversation. I'd love to do it again.
Let's give our panel a round of applause. On this last program, we feature very poignant one-on-one interviews with members of our special Columbine discussion panel in an effort to gain more personal insight into the experiences each of my guests had, not only at the time of the attack, but during the intervening 2 decades. Welcome to the show. I'm with Kiki Leba, who was a teacher at Columbine in 1999. Kiki, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
So obviously you have a different perspective. I know that you really helped a lot of kids. In the movie, by the way, you are just fabulous. I was just
Thank you.
Very impressed with how thoughtful you've continued to help people. What has your journey been like since Columbine?
Well, I'm still there. I'm still in the classroom, and the journey has that's really, I mean, a great description of it. It has been so unexpected, the things that this has led to. And initially it was a really difficult thing to come back from. It really impacted me, and I battled pretty severe PTSD and symptoms for quite a few years, and tried to kind of hide those quite a bit. I alluded to it in the film, and then finally made contact with a great trauma therapist, and just made all the difference. And eventually, my experience led me to working with other communities who've been through gun violence. My son Lucas was in Deer Creek Middle School in 2010 when a gunman opened fire outside the school. So our family has been through 2 school shootings, which is unimaginable and crazy, but it's just been such a part of our fabric of our life. And when the Sandy Hook school shootings happened, that really impacted me significantly. But 2 months later, I was sitting around a table with a bunch of Sandy Hook school teachers.
So you went to Newtown?
I went to Newtown, and actually one of the teachers reached out to us and arranged it. And we went, one of my coworkers, Paula Reed, we went for a couple days. For 2 days in a row, we sat around this large table in a bed and breakfast, and we just talked. And we answered their questions and shared our experience. And it was powerful. I realized that they had a lot of questions, and I was surprised how many I could answer just because of what we had been through. And it was a really, just a great connection for both of us, both communities. And we have since stayed in touch with quite a few of the staff members. And it was something that really impacted me, and I recognized that I really liked doing that work. If I wanted to do it, though, I recognized that I also had to be in a really good place, because who wants to walk into that room, you know, and sit with those people? And it's not something that I think most people would think about doing. But since then, I've worked with at my Umpqua Community College. There was a pretty horrific shooting there. Marysville Pilchuck High in Washington, Freeman High School in Washington State. I've known a few people from Virginia Tech, and so over the years, this collection of people I've come in contact with has been completely unexpected, and travel and do a lot of that whenever I can. And most recently was on a panel for school safety for the Congressional Black Caucus, and so things like that I could just never script. It's just same with this film. I was never supposed to be in the film, and Laura wanted to shoot footage. She gets some interior shots, and so she asked Frank, and Frank said, well, she can do it over the summer if you chaperone. So I was a chaperone, and we were talking about some of the stories, and they were talking about the food fight conversation. And I said, oh, that's not quite how I remember it, you know. And so my perspective as a teacher, and I think it was Joe, the cameraman, Laura's unclear on this, but Joe said, you know, Laura, I think we should get some of this. And so we did a couple interviews during the course of that, and I really never expected anything to come of it.
Laura, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me here.
I'd like to know, first of all, what did you learn from doing this movie? And before you answer, I'll give you a second to think. You really did a fabulous job.
Thank you. Thank you. God, I learned a lot about myself going through this process, and it was definitely a healing process through 6 years of talking to other classmates, and just being in the school was helpful for me. And I'm just, you know, I'm glad I got through it, and I'm glad that it's finished and it's out there, and then it's, you know, it's up to the audience to make of it, you know, to take what they want from it.
What do you, I mean, certainly I'm sure an experience like that was cathartic, but it strikes me it had to be traumatic too.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't, you know, I went in thinking it wasn't going to be, and I quickly learned that, you know, reviewing footage, for example, you know, as a filmmaker, that's part of your job, is to look for footage, but when it's that personal, there's some stuff that hits you, and, you know, maybe the film took a little longer to make because of that, and some of those issues, but again, you know, being back in the school was rough that first day, because that was the first time I was back since I graduated.
Right. It also comes out in the film in terms of your, you know, the people you feature in the film, watching them being back in the school. How did you select your participants?
I started with people that I knew best in high school, and that was Amy.
We did not take cover until the janitor came over and yelled from over there, like, get down, get under the table. So we all get under the table. I kind of remember like them coming in, but I don't know exactly what like I saw or didn't see. You know what I mean? I feel like I remember seeing them, but I'm like trying to figure out if that was in the parking lot or if it was like out here. I remember somebody walking down the stairs and seeing what was happening and running back up. And right after that happened, like all you saw was like a swarm of people just like running.
She was sort of the guinea pig, not 100% on board, but after a while she got on board.
Yeah, she did a great job.
Yeah, and there was really no turning back at that point. And then Gus loves telling his story, so that was kind of an easy one.
He's a performer.
He's definitely a performer. And, you know, he doesn't mind sharing his experience, and he's been back to the school to share that as well with students. And then Jamie was last on board, but Jamie and I swam together as kids, so just kind of wondering where everybody was in their process after graduating.
I'm with Rebecca Wilson-Case. Rebecca, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great having a mental health expert on the program. So I'm really curious, just if, you know, stepping back from just the specifics of Columbine, but in your own work and your own analysis in general, why do you think we people do the kinds of things that happened at Columbine and have happened elsewhere, why do we do things like this to each other?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. What we know from the research that has been available profiling mass shooters is that mental illness is by far not the leading cause or predictor for when we're looking at the profile of a mass shooter. Profiles for mass shooters tend to be made up of a complex array of variables, being biological, psychological, physiological, and sociological factors. Having a mental illness certainly is not a predictor that one is going to commit a mass shooting, and mass shootings do not happen because of mental illness. We do, I think, see that we could argue that mass shooters are certainly not the epitome of mental wellness, but we cannot say that a mental illness is necessarily the reason that a mass shooting takes place. I think that we're far from really understanding fully why these things happen, just because it's such a complex array of factors.
Well, in terms of predictors, or at least starting with common variables, certainly one is gender.
Yes, yes.
And so talk a little bit about that in terms of your sense of why almost all mass shootings are committed by men, generally, and younger men.
Well, you know, I think that what we see from the research is that, yes, men are much more likely to commit a mass shooting. And we tend to see that these individuals have had a bit of an isolative nature, have detached from social connections and social circles. And really, as human beings, we are social animals. We are driven to attach. And, you know, one of the most important factors in contributing to resiliency after a traumatic event is connection to others. Likewise, on the opposite side, detachment and isolation from others poses significant risks. You know, I mean, we see in prisons, for example, being stuck in solitary confinement is really a torturous and horrific thing to do to somebody. And so I think that there's a piece of isolation that goes along with this population. And being a male, there's certainly cultural stigma and variables related to, is it okay to seek help? Is it okay to reach out to others? Is it okay to talk about your feelings? And so I think that there's some of those complexities layered throughout that issue and dynamic.
So in some instances, certainly, I mean, when you, going back to mental health briefly, clearly there seems to be a much higher incidence of mental health among people who commit these kinds of crimes, at least from a layperson's perspective, of course, because the assumption is there's got to be something wrong with you to begin with if you do something like this. And so, you know, my guess is that mental health is a predictor. It just may be a really low-level predictor. And so when you talk about the isolation effect, for example, how do we address that? What can we do I mean, obviously, there are a lot of people. Half the kids in high school feel isolated, and even kids who are popular feel isolated. So how do you make that distinction, especially at that age? I mean, when you're in middle school, high school, which can be great years for a lot of kids, but for many, many are really difficult years.
Yeah. Well, I think two things. First off is that individuals who have committed a mass shooting, I think it's about 3%, somewhere within there, have an actual psychiatric history, meaning that they have been treated for a mental illness at some point in the past. So the majority of mass shooters have had no diagnosable psychiatric history, no history of being treated for mental illness, and no indicators that they truly have a mental illness such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, something of that nature. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, to that rule. It's not black and white. However, then in regards to your question...
How does 3% compare to the general, what percent of the general population has had a treated disorder?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know that statistic.
Okay, we'll find out,
off the top
so
of my
don't worry.
head. Yeah, so, but then speaking to just this connection challenge, right? How do we connect in today's world? And you know, it's really interesting that in line with social media, right, and smartphones and our obsession with technology these days, we can be more connected but more isolated than ever before, right? Because we're not having to actually connect with each other as you and I are right now, right? We go onto Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or what have you to connect, and we're missing the real lifetime connection that's happening right in front of us. So I think that there is a challenge encompassed with just the culture that we live in today, and how do we find opportunities to meaningfully connect. The NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, the Arapahoe Douglas chapter, is working on some of this, of starting to brainstorm how do we really create meaningful opportunities to connect in today's world.
How can we do a better job of identifying kids that could be on a path towards violence?
Well, that's probably one of the most difficult things you can do, because you can't profile a mass violent attack, whether it's in schools or our workplace. What we can do, though, is identify kids that we don't allow them to fall through the cracks, that we intervene, whether it's through threat assessment or student assessment, looking for those kinds of signs, and then providing the resources they need, whether we can do it in schools or whether we need outside agencies. When we do that, we are far more successful in putting that child or that young adult back onto a path of not only getting through school and getting grades and passing, but being productive citizens in life. It's those interventions that we do at the school level and working with families that will prevent these things from happening in the future. And when we do that, we can identify the mental health issues that we've seen probably more prevalent in the last 10, 15 years, maybe because of the attention on these horrific acts than we've done in the past.
One of the challenges, it seems, there often is a common theme, not with every school shooter or mass shooter, but one of isolation. But when you think of middle school or when you think high school, half the kids feel isolated. How do you identify someone who needs help? And is a school, what kind of position is a school in to help? And when you look at teachers who have classes with 30, 35, sometimes 40 kids, this seems to be an extraordinary challenge. Just getting through the day is tough enough.
It is, and it's interesting, they did a study shortly after, a couple years after the Columbine tragedy, when they tried to identify or profile these types of individuals that would carry out these acts. And every high school had a child like that. Your high-performing schools and even your most lowest performing schools had children that would fit a certain profile. So you have to throw that out the window. What you look at then, and it is a challenge for schools, partly because the resources that are needed for it. I think when it comes to mental health issues today, it's the lack of resources, trained individuals that can intervene. So you look for signs, whether they're very outwardly signs or inwardly. Teachers are amazing people, and people who work in schools, they see students every day. Kids are spending more time in school than anywhere else other than the home. And so the staff that are in a school, they've become their second adult, or the mentor. They identify kids, and when you see something, say something along that mode, you intervene when you can and provide certain resources, whether the school can do it or not. Is it a challenge? It's an extreme challenge. And like you mentioned, whether you have class sizes of 20 or 30, the idea is how do we continue to do our best to help? And we need resources. We need more people that are trained in specific mental health illnesses. Our guidance counselors are used today for career counseling, pathways to graduation and career. And many of them do have the training to intervene. We need more psychologists, more social workers, and more counselors in schools.
There's a huge shortage in this country of mental health professionals. Psychiatrists have become basically medicine dispensers, drug dispensers, and so many of them do almost no counseling whatsoever. A minimal amount to assess what someone needs in terms of medications. Psychologists in many parts of the country, tremendous shortage. Why haven't we addressed that? Because this situation isn't new. This has been going on for many years. And so even when a school identifies a problem, often schools really don't, within the system or even outside the system, don't have anyone to turn to. What can we do about that? And why haven't we done something about that?
Well, I think we're doing some things about it. I think the way we're seeing so much more of it is the conversations is these things continue to happen. Bad stuff happens. And I think when we see the Parklands and the Sandy Hooks and all these that have occurred since Columbine, it's still relatively very small, as you noted originally, in the grand scheme of things. However, the more you do not tend to those kinds of students that are struggling, are more disenfranchised, disengaged, or have all kinds of issues, the likelihood of them turning to violence is much greater. So I believe what we need to do is, like you said, we need more people that train. Psychologists shouldn't be administering medicine. What they should be doing is assessing and helping to get kids to work through those issues. There are lots of successful stories we don't see in media. They're really in our communities about kids that we've been able to turn around. We do hear about those kids that are turned to guns and other violence because that's the news in that community. There are lots of other success stories. We're a long way from ever being where we can feel comfortable, but we're doing more and we do better because we have more training and more access to the resources that are there. If schools don't have those resources, there are communities that do provide it, whether through communities or county or even state agencies. And we do have those partnerships that are very valuable.
You know, one of the things, clearly as a teacher, you're expected to be strong. You're expected to be the pillar of strength and someone everyone else can lean on, especially in terms of students. Yeah. But at the same time, obviously, you were traumatized and you were falling apart. Tell me about that dichotomy and the dissonance of having to be the one people could lean on and really ready to lie down on the floor with the lights off.
It felt like at the time that school and being in my classroom was the place I could keep it together. It felt like once I made it in from my car into the building, there was just that, I could let loose, just like, oh, I made it. But it was much more difficult out in the world and at home. And so I poured myself into work and the students, and everybody was highly damaged and impacted. And I was also coaching a lot, so that just tremendously long days, just immersed myself in that, I think, I thought it was going to help me and help them. And then when I'd go home and I was just tatters. My family got the leftovers. I was often sleeping, even on the weekends. If I didn't have a game or something, I was probably sleeping, and I was just really unavailable to cope with very much in the world other than what was inside of my classroom. So yeah, it was an incredibly difficult time. I think I isolated from friends outside of school and family, and so it's just sort of kind of chipping away at everything, really.
I remember Frank going down the hall, and I remember I could see down at the end of the hall, I could see the silhouette of a gunman holding a rifle, and I could hear gunshots, but it wasn't that person's, because he was holding it upright like this, and I could hear gunfire, but it was rapid fire, so I knew that it was semi-automatic or automatic.
What about your therapy? What was special about your therapy?
Well, when these things happen, a lot of their therapists and counselors come in and descend upon the community and the school, and not all of them are probably equipped for that kind of trauma. And I remember I met with one of the counselors at school, and I was telling her I was having a bunch of symptoms that I didn't really understand them yet, and I was explaining them to her, and she said to me, well, maybe you just, after school, I want you to just go home and have a nice cup of chamomile tea. And that just enraged me. I remember kind of pounding on the table and elevated my voice, and I was like, I don't want any chamomile tea. I want something that's going to work now. I want something that's going to fix this. And I was in a horrible place, and just felt like there was no relief, and there's no magic pill. And so eventually I went to Columbine Connections. It was a counseling center that had been set up over by the mall. Kind of people could do drop-in stuff, and so eventually I went there.
Set up specifically
it was funded by money that had been gifted to the community from all over the country. And so I went over there, and I just happened to, when I went to sign in, met this woman, Margaret McCormick, and she was a trauma counselor, and she was amazing. She seemed to know exactly where I was at. She could tell me where I had been and where I was going to go, and she was wonderful, and I did some of the EMDR therapy, which sounds like completely like voodoo to anybody who hears about it for the first time, and did just a lot of talking through, and she always gave me homework, and I wanted to understand what was happening to my brain, and I think Marguerite recognized that. So she would give me information on how trauma impacts the brain and the body and your health, and it really, I just began to get those one foot in front of the other and kind of begin to make that return to the closest thing to normal.
So what do you think we can learn, especially as parents, from the movie?
Well, as parents, I think one of the best lines in the film that I always draw from is what Jamie said, which is, we did the best that we could. And as a student, as a high school student, you're trying to do your best, but there are pressures in life and, preparing for college, whatever, just going to school, getting good grades. And I think, for myself, I can speak to, I was, immersed in that and felt that pressure. And then when something like Columbine happens, it's like, you just feel like you're not doing anything right, it can feel that way. And then as an adult, I heard Jamie say to me, interviewing her, we did the best that we could. And that was the first time I had heard that. And that was really comforting to hear at, someone that age to just tell your kids, do the best you can.
All right, two last quick questions,
Sure.
Not easy questions. When you look at the rate of school incidents or shooting incidents in this country and compare it to any other industrialized country, the difference is just stark. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting. I'm often asked that question, and a lot of times people will move then right to the gun rights, and then some will move to mental health, and some will even go after media. And I think the reality is that we've seen a breakdown of family structures. In my 28 years working in public education, I've seen a breakdown in family structures. I've seen more students that struggle with day-to-day needs, whether it's food or shelter. Even in a suburban school district where I'm at today, those needs have to be addressed. And so we have to build coalitions and partnerships and collaborations with our community agencies, our faith communities, because it truly goes back to the African proverb, it does take a village. So when we have those in place, we can maximize that social capital, if you will, that people then focus on the needs of our kids and our community, not just kids, but young adults that struggle too. We have lots of college students. I have kids in college that they deal with the same thing. They're just a little bit more complex brains, and so they can understand some of the things they're dealing with. Unfortunately, a lot of it is then we turn to certain types of drugs to deal with it. And I think more of that we have to get away from that and more focus on the family structures, the community structures. If there are broken families, let's cover that through our community structures.
One of the interesting things I noticed in the movie is your decision to not mention the attackers, the killers, or even those who were, there's no focus on those who were killed or injured. Tell me about your thought process about that.
Honestly, well, so not mentioning the shooters, that was deliberate. I just didn't want to, glorify that or have that be the focus. And I didn't know them. Again, I was a freshman, so just trying to get from point A to point B. And I didn't have any interactions with them, so I didn't feel like I could speak on that topic. And then the victims, I'm not going to lie, I'm not happy about. I think there is still time to put that in the end, honestly, as some text on screen or something. I just wanted to focus on what we knew, which was the freshman class and the kids that were there and the ones that were willing to talk. And I think it's hard to get people that are in a different space, maybe not in the best place to talk about their experience. It's hard to get them on camera. So I wanted to focus on what we knew, have it be in our own words, and then go from there.
please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.